Hello! Today I want to talk about a topic that I think is extremely important and relevant, and that is the sinking of the RMS Titanic. This year marked the 25th anniversary of James Cameron's Titanic, and it was a reminder not only of that movie's enduring status in popular culture, but also the story of the Titanic itself. The Titanic is one of the most well-known stories on Earth, and most people would generally credit that movie as the thing that cemented it in our collective consciousness. However, the depths of our cultural obsession with this ship actually go far, far deeper. Dare I say, that movie is only the tip of the iceberg. There's an old saying that behind Jesus and the Civil War, the Titanic is the third most written about event in history, and whilst that's definitely not true, it's also not that far off. The Titanic story has infected almost every sect of human culture, from religion,
change course,
to video games,
we're trapped, we'll drown,
to musicals,
iceberg right ahead,
to online messaging boards where every year people roleplay as passengers on the Titanic. It all raises the very obvious question of why. Because whilst it was the biggest maritime disaster ever for its time, it was quickly followed by, 2 world wars and a plethora of other disasters and tragedies that were much worse. Well, it's because the sinking of the Titanic had something that few other tragedies have, and that's drama, baby. The sinking of the Titanic was as much a disaster as it was Greek tragedy, complete with lofty themes of hubris, fate, and morality. And as such, we have ascribed it with similarly profound meaning in our history, as the moment where the 20th century lost its innocence, a sort of Manson murders but for the industrial age. However, the story of the Titanic has never been confined in its interpretation, and over the decades, that already exaggerated story was slowly mythologized for all manner of purposes. At some point, the Titanic ceased to be history and became a piece of pop culture. I mean, it's really the only disaster you can say has a fan base. And I think that is because the Titanic disaster now seemingly exists in this bizarre Goldilocks zone of history, where it is still a relatively recent historical tragedy that killed a lot of people, but seemingly not enough for people, not to feel weird about wearing a t-shirt of it. The first step in solving a problem is accepting you have one, and I think we all need to accept we have a Titanic problem.
If you have not experienced the Titanic Museum attraction yet, you must come aboard.
Now, whilst there's nothing wrong with having an interest in the Titanic, and God knows I can't talk anymore, it becomes emblematic of a problem when interest in history becomes corrupted by obsession for a romanticized idea, an idea that companies can sell to you, in some cases, by literally trying to build a second Titanic.
And we have implemented a new safety deck to include all the safety features, lifeboats, and so on.
And what's worse is that this strange obsession shows no signs of slowing. We are currently living in a world where immigrants continue to die at sea every day due to British policy, and the Titanic has now become a luxury for rich people to dive to in extremely unsafe technological conditions.
It's the OceanGate Titanic experience.
It's very well engineered and very safe, but then the team is very focused on safety first.
The communication is really key, I think, knowing that they never lost communication.
Not 1 second of me experiencing anything from OceanGate have I ever felt unsafe.
Come join us on our next expedition. Don't miss the opportunity to be part of history.
So, the first line of this video was supposed to be a joke, and now it's somehow true that the Titanic is genuinely relevant again. Our cultural obsession has finally reached a tragic and inevitable conclusion, which is that people loved the Titanic so much they made it happen again. Once again, a toxic mix of technological hubris and obscene wealth resulted in disaster, all the while hundreds of poor people died, which no one seemed to care about because they were too busy reveling in the drama of rich people slowly suffocating at the bottom of the ocean. And the truly guilty will never be held responsible through a combination of legal trickery and the fact they're dead now. Some have hailed these passengers as heroes and explorers, others have mourned it as a senseless tragedy, but most of us just got lost in the insane humour of the fact that we as a human society have seemingly not changed in over 100 years.
What the piece of shit?
So today I want to figure out how the hell we got here, and the only way I could do that was by becoming obsessed myself. Over the past few months, I decided to watch every Titanic movie. I dove into the darkest depths of our cultural obsession, and now I rise to the surface to talk about it. So let's get started, shall we, with the first Titanic movie in 1912. This video will be long. In hindsight, the Titanic couldn't have really sank at a better time, because it was right as the rise of mass media and cinema allowed the story to capture the fears and imaginations of people around the world. The myth-making of Titanic was almost instantaneous, and so was its monetization. Within weeks of the sinking, there was an entire market dedicated to Titanic memorabilia. And as weird as that all sounds, it was emblematic of a genuine desperation that people had at this time to try and process the trauma of this event in any way they could. Because in 1912, nobody was able to relive tragedy the way that we do now.
Look how much of an angle it's at!
There was no footage of the Titanic sinking, only newsreels that consisted mostly of still photographs or paintings. Some cinemas even hired bands and handed out lyrics of Nearer My God to Thee so that the audience could reenact the ship's final moments themselves. Eventually, movies had to step in to fill this void, and so in the year 1912 alone, there were 3 whole movies made about the Titanic, not just from America, but from all around the world. Germany produced the 40-minute silent film in Nacht Und Eis, which for its time is a genuinely impressive portrayal of the sinking. It gives a faithful recreation of what life was like for the passengers, as well as a somber retelling of their eventual fates. Now, that's not to say that it's all played with respectful levels of restraint. I mean, I think there's no greater catnip to a silent film actor than having them act like a ship is sinking. And ironically, for Germany in 1912, the film primarily serves to aggrandize the stories of British heroism from the sinking. This was at the time the mainstream version of the Titanic story, one that was dominated by themes of bravery and sacrifice. The French, however, took a very different approach with their film La Hantise, or The Obsession. This movie isn't about the Titanic or its passengers, but instead focuses on one woman's mounting dread after a palm reader warns her that someone she loves is doomed to die, right as her husband announces his intention to travel on the Titanic. And despite the husband eventually surviving the sinking, the emotional stress sends their son into a coma, leading the woman to realise that it may have been him doomed to die all along. Now, whilst the ending completely ruins it by having everything end happily, it does somewhat tap into a deeper fear that many audiences were reckoning with in the wake of the Titanic. In a much more religious society, this sinking was no less than divine punishment. The ship itself was named after the titans that challenged God and were smited for their hubris. For some, the Titanic wasn't just another tragedy, it was like Y2K. It was an omen of existential doom. However, the film that I think best encapsulates this era of Titanic movies has long been considered lost, and that is Saved from the Titanic. There are many things about this movie that are utterly fascinating, like the fact that all remaining prints were destroyed in a studio fire, as well as the fact that it was made and released within 31 days of the sinking. But undoubtedly the most fascinating part of this film is its co-writer and star, Dorothy Gibson. Dorothy had been a passenger on the Titanic, and she was travelling to New York to meet with representatives from her acting agency, one of which she happened to be having an affair with, a man by the name of Jules Brulator. And while she survived the sinking, she had been deeply traumatized. Other survivors reportedly heard her muttering in the lifeboat, "I'll never get to ride in my little grey car again." However, when news got back to Jules Brulator at the agency, the first thing he did was rush a camera crew down to New York Harbour to capture her arrival on the Carpathia. And within a matter of days, he would convince Dorothy to transform her invaluable experiences into a film, even having her wear the same clothes she did on the night of the sinking. And so together, Dorothy and Jules created Saved from the Titanic, which instead of being an authentic retelling of Dorothy's story, is a factually similar but completely fictionalized version of events. Running at only 10 minutes long, the film essentially presents a fantasy version of Dorothy's life, one where she and her lover end up happily ever after, and where she overcomes the trauma that she endured during the sinking. Real life, of course, was not so kind to Dorothy, whose real future husband was behind a camera abusing her for financial gain. Dorothy reportedly burst into tears several times whilst making the film, and soon after its completion, she would suffer a full mental breakdown, fleeing to Europe where she would quickly become a Nazi sympathizer and die in 1946. Saved from the Titanic would end up being her final film, but it would also arguably be her most successful, drawing crowds from around the world. Though it was rightly criticised in the press for capitalising so soon on the tragedy, Dorothy had been quoted as saying that she wanted to make the film to honour those that had died. But there is a deeper motivation that is shared by all three of these movies. This whole period of Titanic filmmaking is defined by how it tried to provide audiences with comfort and safety in the wake of this event. Films offer us a way to reenact traumatic events in a controlled way by which we can process them, but it also allows us to manipulate the facts to suit whatever version of reality we would rather live in. And Dorothy's story is just a magnification of that on an extreme level, about someone who has gone through a trauma and is now trying to control it by creating a fantasy version of her real life. In only a year, the Titanic story had conquered the world, but it was about to be quickly extinguished by the start of the First World War in 1914. And it would be over a decade before the Titanic story would resurface again. The war had left behind a fundamentally different world from when the Titanic had first sank, and that of course called for a very different kind of Titanic story. Not only that, but the invention of sound film meant that audiences could now experience this event with a whole new dimension. But as anyone who's seen Babylon knows, shooting with sound film in this nation period was a goddamn nightmare. And that fact is plastered all over 1929's Atlantic. The director of Atlantic, Ewald Dupont, shot two different versions of this movie at the same time, one in English and one in his native German. Dupont insisted to the actors that they deliver their lines in English as slowly as possible so that he could better understand them, which you can't really notice in the final film.
Because they said you were dangerous.
Atlantic was laughed out of most English-speaking cinemas, and it was unfairly lumped in with the wave of awkward early talkie movies. However, I want to go back for this movie, because I truly think it is one of the best Titanic films we have. This is the Titanic colliding head-on with German expressionism, and whilst yes, that means it is very slow and stilted, it also creates a genuine sense of dread. This movie isn't about characters trying to survive, but a room full of people who have more or less accepted their fate and are now just trying to come to terms with their impending death. So much of this movie's strengths are a direct result of those limitations. It lulls you into the sense that you're in a dream before turning it into a surreal nightmare. The starkness of the black and white footage doesn't just add a natural gothicness, it also gives a genuinely authentic glimpse of what this event must have been like. Because unlike most adaptations, when the lights went out in the Titanic, survivors were not plunged into a studio-lit dark blue, but a terrifying pitch black that deprived survivors of everything but the sounds of its victims. Of course, not all of this movie's limitations are inherently strengths. Some creative choices do break the tension a bit. The worst of which being the deeply loaded and historically inaccurate inclusion of a black man trying to storm one of the lifeboats, which despite its obvious racist intentions, does make it one of the only adaptations to actually acknowledge the existence of a black man on the Titanic. Joseph LaRoche, who was a Haitian engineer, was travelling as a second-class passenger with his family, and like many others made the choice to stay behind so that they could be rescued. But as you might have guessed, Joseph's story was mostly erased from the history of this sinking. And it's because the Titanic story was almost immediately appropriated by the media as enduring evidence of the innate heroism of white British men. However, in African American culture, the Titanic came to represent something very different. In a 1948 song by Leadbelly, the sinking is portrayed as an act of retribution for white racism after the captain rejects a black passenger. And in Black American folklore, the story of the Titanic became like a fable that sought to teach others not to covet white wealth or social status because it too was fallible.
When the news got around the world that the great Titanic had hit this big iceberg, Sean was in Chicago in Cottage Grove in 63rd. Down on his knees, Nikolai shooting a dime, I hope to pay. I left 10,000 rich motherfuckers swinging on their ass.
And the reason I find all of this so fascinating is because it proves that not only have people been making fun of white people's weird obsession with the ship for over a century, but it is also one of the earliest iterations of black artists lampooning white ignorance to the dangers of the real world.
The band was playing as the ship went down.
And above all, it touches on a core reason behind why the Titanic has become as famous as it has, which is that rich white people died on it. And that struck a nerve with other rich white people in the media. And as such, it was the media that created the self-importance of the Titanic story, one that often overshadowed the factually accurate version. Because at this point in time, the only definitive accounts of this tragedy were from the extremely botched and biased public inquiries that mostly functioned to cover up for the rich industry moguls that were involved. And that lack of a clear official account allowed people to manipulate the facts of the sinking to fit whatever narrative they wanted. Which leads us on to our next Titanic film, and if you don't know about it, it sure is a surprise. After the failure of Atlantic, there had been some more efforts to make more Titanic movies with directors like Alfred Hitchcock and Howard Hughes attached, but most of them weren't made because British censors weren't really looking for movies about British industrial failure right now. This of course played right into the hands of the Nazis, who saw the Titanic story as the perfect opportunity to skewer not just the British naval industry, but the entire system of capitalism. During the Nazis' reign, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda oversaw the production of 1,200 movies, a significant portion of which were overt propaganda, which was meant to indoctrinate its audience with Nazi ideals. And so we get 1943's Titanic, or what I will be calling for clarity, Nazi Titanic. A movie that features the most Aryan-looking British officers being told by a completely made-up German engineer character that they must swallow their pride and listen to reason.
The Titanic sinkt.
The Titanic sinkt?
Now before I say what I'm going to say next, I'm just going to put this disclaimer here for a while. No reason. But if this movie has one virtue, it's that not only are many of its criticisms valid, but they actually get to the real heart of why the Titanic happened. Pretty much every Titanic movie goes through the same rote repetitions of the myriad causes behind the sinking. The ignorance of iceberg warnings, the captain accelerating in attempts to break a speed record, the ship only being equipped with white flares, and of course, there not being enough lifeboats for everyone on board. But Nazi Titanic is one of the only adaptations to actually point out the unifying factor of all of these things, which is that they are the result of a capitalist system that prioritized financial interests above all else. And new discoveries have only gone on to reinforce this idea. Scientists recently discovered that the rivets used on the Titanic were actually second-rate because they were cheaper. Now, once again, I'm not saying that the Nazis were right. I'm just saying, you know, a stopped clock. And whilst those criticisms are valid, Nazi Titanic still somehow ended up being a completely failed piece of propaganda. Because not only was technological hubris a concept completely unknown to Germany at this point, but the behind-the-scenes story of this movie's production proves that neither was financial greed or indifference to human suffering. The wartime production of Nazi Titanic meant that it was fraught with difficulties, inflating the budget so badly that it ended up costing more than the actual Titanic. Many of the background naval men we see in the film are played by real Nazi officers who apparently spent most of their time on set just harassing their female co-stars. And when the director, Herbert Selpin, criticised Nazi leadership to Joseph Goebbels, he was quickly imprisoned and found hanged in his cell the next day. But eventually the Nazi high-ups realised that Selpin was right, and that maybe telling a story about mass death caused by a reckless leader who's being willfully ignorant of reality wasn't very convenient right now. By the time of the film's completion, German audiences were being bombarded daily by Allied bombing raids, and scenes of third-class passengers trapped below deck were deemed too risky after circulating footage of concentration camps. And as a final dark note in the story of this movie, the real ship they shot it on, the Cap Arcona, was sunk by the Allies at the end of the war when it was transporting over 5,000 Nazi prisoners, meaning that the Nazi Titanic ended up killing more people than the actual Titanic. And so, in no surprise to anyone, Nazi Titanic is a very strange movie. It is also a fascinating case study of how propaganda can end up being a projection of the insecurities of its creator. Many scenes in this movie end up becoming eerie foreshadowing of the events that would befall many of the Nazis involved with its making. However, the most unusual parallels found in this movie are not to real life, but to none other than James Cameron's Titanic. Now, whilst James Cameron's movie openly pays homage to many Titanic movies that had preceded it, the fact that both of these films feature a blue diamond, a woman in arranged marriage who falls in love on the ship, as well as a scene where a man is trapped in a first-class cabin only to be rescued by an axe is interesting to say the least. Now, I highly doubt that James Cameron was trying to tip his hat to the Nazis here, but I think it's fascinating that despite being so radically different, many of the Titanic movies repeatedly converge in these similar themes and tropes, and to be honest, all of this made me start to wonder what other secrets those Nazi movies might hold. So be sure to like and subscribe, where I will be watching every Nazi movie next. By the end of the Second World War, the Titanic story had found itself at a turning point in cinematic history. Whilst wartime moviegoing had been dominated by romance and escapism, more movies were now beginning to grapple with the complex and ambiguous emotions that people were dealing with. And thus the landscape of post-war cinema existed in this strange sort of dichotomy between those that still sought to provide respite from trauma and those that tried to actually confront it. And in the 1950s, we got two very different Titanic movies that sit at either end of that spectrum. The first being 1953's Titanic, produced by 20th Century Fox, the same studio that would go on to make Cameron's movie over 4 decades later. Now that the war had been won, many of the restrictions that previous filmmakers had faced had now evaporated, and storytellers could now take full license of the Titanic story. However, this movie didn't really have any interest in being historically accurate. It really is just a melodrama that happens to take place on the Titanic. Remind you of anything? This is an extremely Hollywoodized version of the Titanic story, with big name stars like Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb, as well as the most waspy looking cast I have ever seen.
There's a dance they do on the reservation. It's a dip and a glide and a hesitation.
I mean, this thing is just stacked wall to wall with 50s male actors who look like they're at a Fallout game, and this guy who just looks like James Franco. Webb's character isn't based on any specific real person, but rather a loose representation of the 25 multimillionaires who died on the Titanic. And his character undergoes a sort of moral redemption through the sinking. Throughout the movie, we watch as he schemes to steal back his daughter from his estranged wife, and practically disowns his son after finding out that he isn't the biological father. But after the ship begins to sink, he chooses to sacrifice himself, allowing his wife and daughter to be together, and reaffirming his love for his son. It all makes for a film that I think is truly the nadir of our Titanic romanticization, because it reinforces a problematic narrative that even now dominates the story of this event. And that is, with the notable exception of someone like Molly Brown, so many of the stories that are told about the Titanic are from the perspective of the bravery and sacrifice of rich white men, which is not inherently inaccurate. But what's problematic is how the narrative was whitewashed to focus almost solely on them. So for example, in this film, a brave action that's performed by Webb's son was in real life done by a Mexican passenger in first class by the name of Manuel Urichurtu, a man that few people know about because he's never been represented in any of these stories. However, someone like Benjamin Guggenheim has been more or less iconized in adaptations for how he assisted women and children onto lifeboats before changing into full evening wear and letting out the eponymous quote that we intend to go down like gentlemen. Now, I'm not trying to retroactively cancel Benjamin Guggenheim, but the way I see people kind of blindly aggrandizing that quote often overlooks its uncomfortable nuances. To die like a gentleman isn't just a reflection of chivalrous bravery, it is also arguably a refusal to be equaled to any class status lower than your own, even in the face of death. There are many true stories of first-class heroism from the Titanic. But what is also true is that more children in third class died than men in first class. And yet what the media chose to focus on was the much more dramatic story of a rich white male sacrificing his life of luxury to die as a common man. Which is ironic because it totally overshadowed the deaths of hundreds of other people who were completely ignored because they were poor and their deaths weren't as interesting. The media essentially hijacked the story of the Titanic into becoming a redemption story about how this disaster transformed rich, privileged men into selfless heroes. And if you still don't believe me, well, I would just like to remind you that this is something that the media did last month.
The Greek migrants that drowned, there was no Titanic angle. Number one, huge angle. Number two, we had guests that knew people that were submerged. Number three, there was suspense because we had the countdown to the air.
Less than a quarter of those in third class lived to tell their story, but regardless of that, any Titanic movie that completely ignores them will always be incomplete. However, this movie was soon about to be met by its polar opposite. In 1958, A Night to Remember. Even now, A Night to Remember is considered to be not just the best Titanic movie, but one of the most authentic portrayals of this event ever put to film. Because despite there having already been 5 Titanic movies by this point, none of them had presented a truly accurate version of events, and so A Night to Remember set out to do just that, being more of a docudrama than a traditional movie. The film was based on the book of the same name by Walter Lord, which was released 3 years prior, and to this day, that remains a definitive account of the Titanic tragedy, preserving the testimonies of 63 survivors. And A Night to Remember was genuinely ahead of its time in how it incorporated its subjects into the filmmaking process, having several survivors act as technical advisors on the production. And that choice isn't merely in the interests of historical accuracy. It is a more meaningful inclusion that means that those affected by the tragedy feel agency in the telling of their story. But I think, as we learned earlier, having survivors interact with a reconstructed version of their trauma is never going to be not complicated. Helen Melville Smith, who was the daughter of the real Captain Smith, reportedly became overwhelmed with emotion when she met the actor playing her real father. And a man by the name of Lawrence Beasley, who was a survivor, snuck on set whilst they were filming a big sinking scene because he reportedly wanted to go down with the ship. It's a story that is as amusing as it is unsettling, because it's unclear whether Beasley was doing this as a meaningless prank, or whether it was a subconscious impulse of survivor's guilt. Nevertheless, the way that this film shows respect for its subject is in the restrained way that it tells its story. There's no big musical flourishes or dramatic moments, and there's no real main character or central conflict aside from the ship and the sinking itself. And it's that lack of embellishment, the understated way by which it shows its death and destruction, that ends up being the true power of the film. Though I will admit at this point, I was a bit desensitized to the loss of human life. Authenticity is the secret weapon of this movie, not just in its historical accuracy, but in what it has to say emotionally about the Titanic. A Night to Remember isn't just about that time that a big ship sank, it's about the existential dread that consumes people after the unthinkable happens to them. And that is a crucial part of the Titanic story. It's often interpreted as a parable about how the unforeseeable can happen, which is kind of ironic when you start to realise that someone literally did foresee it happening. In Morgan Robertson's 1898 novel Futility, he predicted the Titanic disaster down to its almost every detail. It follows an Olympic-class ship that clashes with an iceberg that also doesn't have enough lifeboats on board to save everyone. Now, I won't argue that the Titanic wasn't unprecedented for its time, but I also think it's true that many of those people that were calling it unforeseeable were probably the same people who are also trying to defend against lawsuits. And whilst A Night to Remember is by far the most authentic Titanic adaptation, it is by no means perfect. It is almost an inevitability of historical fiction that facts have to be condensed or manipulated in order to accommodate the needs of a story. And eventually, gaps will begin to form between what a person did in real life and what their character has to do in a movie. The closest thing that A Night to Remember has to a main character is in Second Officer Lightoller, played by Kenneth More, based on the real officer who ended up surviving the sinking. And in the film, he is the quintessential British naval officer. He is a chivalrous leader whose even-headed, tough exterior is slowly chipped away by the trauma of the disaster. However, many of the actions performed by Lightoller in the movie weren't done by him in real life, but by several different officers during the real sinking. In the film, Lightoller is like a paragon of duty-bound honour and leadership. But in real life, his interpretation of women and children only meant that he lowered many of the lifeboats half full, and he has since been held responsible by some historians as directly responsible for many of the deaths. And if that wasn't enough, Lightoller would go on to admit to war crimes in his autobiography, so nobody's perfect, is what I'm trying to say. Conversely, the closest thing that this movie has to a villain is in White Star Line company man J. Bruce Ismay, who is there to contrast Lightoller's bravery with his cowardice actions during the sinking. But once again, real life is not as simple as what is portrayed in the story. Bruce Ismay was a company man for the White Star Line, and as such, he should rightly hold a huge amount of guilt for what happened. But his impulse decision to save himself rather than make the chivalrous sacrifice of other men became the sole focus of many people's anger in the wake of this event. And that disproportionate focus on the cowardice of an individual became a convenient scapegoat for the myriad of other guilty company men that were allowed to escape justice. Now, none of this is to say that A Night to Remember is completely void of moral ambiguity or nuance, but it all feels a bit more egregious when you get to the ending slate of this movie that essentially tries to lie to you by saying, "Don't worry guys, we fixed it. Everything's fine now because we decided that we should have the same amount of lifeboats as people on the ship." Well done, everyone, we did it! It completely contradicts what is the true power of this movie. One where there is no moral redemption awarded to its characters after what they go through, where they are forced to reckon with the truly meaningless nature of what has happened to them. But regardless of all that, this movie is pretty fantastic, and it is arguably one of the most influential movies of its time, because it didn't just bring the Titanic back into the mainstream, it would eventually go on to inspire a whole new wave of disaster movies. And so by the time of the late 70s, we got 2 separate Titanic movies made within a year of each other. And if that wasn't strange enough, the producers of each movie happened to be brothers in real life who did not know that the other was making a Titanic movie until they both started production. Cue the next chapter of Titanic filmmaking, or what I simply like to call
Sunday is more of the most lovable critters you'll ever see. It's more of those amazing animals. And then...
Iceberg right ahead! She's sinking.
They said she'd last forever. She's never been seen since. SOS Titanic.
Decades on from the actual sinking, the Titanic continued to tear families apart when Bernard Delfont and Lou Grade both greenlit Titanic movies at their respective studios at the same time. The first was Delfont's SOS Titanic, which was shot in 8 weeks and released as a TV movie. 2 things I don't think the Titanic story particularly called for. But despite its very modest budget, SOS Titanic does bring some new angles to the story. It cuts between 3 separate sets of characters in each class section of the ship, and it also has some genuine stars in there. It's got Ian Holm doing a great Bruce Ismay, and Helen Mirren doing what I can only describe as her best.
Oh no, madam, I couldn't possibly.
Besides from that, this is one of the few Titanic adaptations that actually cast actors from Northern Ireland to play Irish immigrants, and it adds a genuine authenticity and humanity to them. These characters aren't defined by an accent or a scene where they all drink and dance in steerage. They actually feel like rounded human beings who have an identity beyond their class status or nationality, something which many other adaptations fail to do.
I go to America!
However, the real heart of this movie revolves around a love story between 2 second-class passengers, one of whom is called Lawrence Beasley, who you may remember as the Titanic survivor that tried to walk on set during A Night to Remember. Well, here he's played by David Warner, who would later go on to play Billy Zane's henchman in James Cameron's Titanic. Now, none of that really matters, but I needed someone to know that, okay? But what is actually important about this adaptation is that it is one of the first that has a much more socially conscious perspective of how it views the disaster. There is no star-crossed lovers between classes in this adaptation, and the only lovers who do survive are left with bitter cynicism rather than romantic hope. The ending follows Beasley going on a long diatribe that does break down a core truth about the disaster, which is that the Titanic was only an unforeseeable catastrophe for those whose privileged worldview it had shattered, but for many of those in third class, that illusion had been broken a long time ago. And after doing my research into Bernard Delfont, this particular perspective on Titanic started to make a lot more sense. At the time of making this film, Delfont was a member of the British upper class. He was an appointed baron in the House of Lords and a multi-millionaire. But he was also an immigrant who had been born into poverty in Tokmak, Ukraine, whose family had emigrated to the UK to find a better life. Delfont was one of those rare people who had experienced both ends of the class spectrum, and much like his second-class love interests, he was now left somewhere in the middle, looking on, ruminating on the differences between the two, about the way things are, and how they've always been. SOS Titanic is often overlooked in the history of the Titanic movies, but I don't think it should be, because it implies something profound. That the Titanic was not some defining moment in history, but merely another symptom in a long illness that society continues to suffer from. And so you may wonder, what nuanced perspective did Bernard's brother Lou bring to the Titanic story? Well, he went and made... Many people have interpreted the story of the Titanic to be like a fable about man's relationship with nature. It's a reminder that we must respect its power and not fall victim to our own technological hubris. And the premise of Raise the Titanic essentially says the polar opposite, that we need to show the sea who's boss by retroactively unsinking the Titanic. But then of course there is the question of why? Well, this movie offers potentially the best explanation I've ever heard, which is, what if raising the Titanic could end the Cold War?
Are you talking about raising the Titanic?
If we're lucky, we could make nuclear warfare obsolete.
Raise the Titanic actually started life as a novel by Clive Cussler, which was a spy espionage thriller that was the first in a series he wrote featuring his James Bond-esque character of Dirk Pitt. The plot of the movie revolves around a team of American scientists led by Pitt, who are tasked with finding and raising the Titanic so that they can extract a rare mineral that they believe to be trapped in a safe on the sunken ship. To fuel a missile defense system that could end nuclear war, 17 writers worked on the script for Raise the Titanic, including an uncredited Navy officer who demanded that it be altered so that the Russians were never portrayed to be smarter than the Americans at any point. And what results is a movie that kind of works as like a spiritual anti-sequel to the Nazi Titanic movie. The ending of this movie kind of tricks its audience into thinking that our characters have learnt a lesson from the story of the Titanic. After realizing that the safe on the wreck is empty, they discover that the rare mineral that they were looking for was actually buried in a grave on land the whole time. And when faced with the decision of digging it up, our characters decide that some things must stay buried, essentially reiterating the core message of the Titanic that we shouldn't fall victim to our own technological ambitions. However, that message is utterly mired in a final act that is designed to flaunt America's industrial strength over that of Russia's, and essentially prove that capitalism wins. When the Americans triumph over the Russians and take custody of the wreck, they raise the White Star Line's flag, which in this context acts as like an anti-communist symbol. And to round off this big patriotic finale, the American military hauls the wreck of the Titanic to its original destination, New York Harbor. Music swells as the ship's bow looks out onto the Statue of Liberty, and then it started to dawn on me. They're not going to show the Titanic next to the World Trade Center, are they? It is truly one of the most provocative images I have ever seen in a film. What was intended to be a symbol of America's strength and resilience is now a painful reminder of its hubris. But look, all in all, this movie is very dumb and not very good, and I simply demand sequels. What's next for Dirk Pitt? He's got to turn the pyramids upside down to beat the Chinese.
For explorer Dirk Pitt and his team, Sahara. Directed by Breck Eisner.
But unfortunately, Raise the Titanic became one of the biggest box office bombs of all time, and in a famous quote from Lou Grade, he said, "It would have been cheaper to have lowered the Atlantic." With the failures of both these movies, it was perhaps a sign that maybe audiences had finally had enough of the Titanic story. But if there's one thing we know by now, it's that whenever this happens in history, like life, Titanic finds a way. And in 1985, the discovery of the real wreck would harken in one of the strangest chapters of the Titanic story. One that took place not in movies, but entirely in real life. Get ready for the biggest detour you've ever seen in a video essay, folks. They say that truth is stranger than fiction, and that has never been truer than the very insane story of real human beings trying to raise the actual Titanic. Plans to raise the wreck of the real Titanic actually date back to immediately after it first sank in 1912. Many of the richest families who lost loved ones in the sinking tried to fund efforts in order to reclaim the huge amount of wealth that was lost. But obviously, technology was nowhere near able to reach the required depths in order to find the wreck, let alone actually raising it. But by the 1970s, the invention of advanced sonar equipment meant that the pipe dream of finding the Titanic had now become a reality. However, unlike as is portrayed in the movie, the types of people that this mammoth task attracted weren't government scientists, but mostly insane men with a huge amount of time on their hands and disposable wealth. Basically, the kind of people who pitched the following real ideas to try and raise the wreck of the Titanic. They included filling the ship with ping pong balls, injecting the ship's hull with an industrial amount of Vaseline, and my personal favourite, encasing the wreck in a massive iceberg made of liquid nitrogen. Now, most of them were purely motivated by financial gain. Some wanted to use the publicity of the discovery to fund other ventures, whilst others just straight up wanted to plunder the wreck for its rumoured riches. However, there was one attempt that was different, made by a Texas oil tycoon by the name of Jack Grimm. Grimm had struck oil when he was 31 and had since used his newfound wealth in order to fund a variety of expeditions dedicated to discovering mythical entities. And this is why Grimm was special, because he wasn't just in it for the money. Deep down, his real motivation was purely the sense of adventure. And he assembled a crack team to join his expedition that included world-leading scientists, marine biologists, and a monkey called Titan, insisting that he had had him trained to point out on a map where the wreck of the Titanic was, to which his scientists replied, "It's either us or the monkey." But despite having to send Titan home, it was all a part of Grimm's wider plan to drum up as much publicity for this expedition as possible, as insurance for his gargantuan financial investment. And the crown jewel of that plan was a documentary that Grimm had specially commissioned to be made about the voyage, called In Search of the Titanic. Now, there are countless documentaries made about the Titanic and its subsequent discovery, but this is the only one to have its own original theme song.
We're gonna find the Titanic in her cold and lonely grave.
And if that wasn't weird enough for you, this documentary is narrated by the one and only Orson Welles, who spends most of it struggling to decide whether to speak or breathe.
From a book by Jules Verne written in the last century, long before such a voyage.
But despite the documentary following Grimm and his team over the course of years and multiple expeditions, none of them were able to ever find the real wreck. So a documentary that was initially supposed to be about the discovery of the Titanic ends up becoming in its own way about failure and man being bested by the elements once again. However, on the last venture, Grimm and his team were offered one slight moment of hope when the recordings captured a brief glimpse of what some thought could be the Titanic's propeller. And despite being unable to definitively confirm it, Grimm returned from the expedition claiming that they had indeed found the Titanic. But because this was the same man who once returned from Turkey with a piece of wood, insisting that it was from Noah's Ark, no one, including his own scientists, believed him. And the saddest part of this boy who cried wolf story is that it was later discovered that their sonar had gone right over the location of the wreck. Their equipment had just failed to see it. But despite that disappointment, Grimm's wish did sort of come true in the end, when he began to receive letters from kids around the world who were inspired by his story and his sense of adventure. But eventually, someone else would come along to truly claim the glory of the Titanic, and thankfully, they were a lot more qualified. Robert Ballard. Like Grimm, Ballard was an explorer, and he had a deep fascination with shipwrecks such as the Titanic. But unlike Grimm, he was a professor of oceanography, whose passion and dedication to learning about and protecting marine life had made him a preeminent figure in the nascent field of underwater archaeology. And his experience as a US Navy officer meant that he had gained experience working with remote-guided submersibles, technology that Ballard knew would be fundamental in trying to find the wreck. However, because the Navy weren't just going to loan him those submersibles to look for the Titanic, Ballard struck an agreement with them that he would first use their technology to find 2 US nuclear submarines that had sunk in the early 1960s. And once he had found them, he could use any spare time or resources to, just casually discover the Titanic as well. Knowing that they would be against the clock, Ballard and his team eventually discovered a strategy that they knew would maximize the efficiency of their search. When they eventually found the sunken submarines, they discovered that their hulls had imploded from the immense pressures of the depths where they lay, and so they decided to use that logic and apply it to the wreck of the Titanic. Instead of just randomly combing the area like Grimm had done, Ballard chose to instead focus on finding the various debris that will have spilled out from the wreck over time, using that as a breadcrumb trail to find the ship itself. And eventually it paid off. On the 2nd of September 1985, Ballard and his team became the first human beings to lay eyes upon the Titanic since it went down. Once again, the world's most famous ship was thrust back into the public spotlight, and people around the world were in awe of the sight of the great Titanic.
A very exciting week of discovery. When we come back...
However, that celebratory period lasted a very short time, because almost immediately, the vultures descended, and the Titanic became the focus of a very long and very complicated battle defined by one single question: who owns the Titanic? It had been decades since the White Star Line was a functioning company, and because the Titanic had long been considered a lost asset, it never changed hands in ownership. Not only that, but because the ship had sunk in international waters, custody of the Titanic reverted to principles of international maritime law. In other words, finders keepers. However, even that was also unclear, because Ballard, who had actually discovered the ship, did not want to claim ownership nor make any salvage. He regarded that as tantamount to grave robbing. Jack Grimm, however, who still insisted that he was the first person to find the wreck, argued that it should be salvaged to prevent it from further eroding at the bottom of the ocean. Inspired by Ballard, the US government actually passed legislation in 1986, the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act, which tried to govern the wreck of the Titanic by strict scientific guidelines and to designate the site as an official memorial. But that domestic legislation was essentially useless when potential salvagers were coming from around the world, not just the US. And without any international treaties in place, it meant that the wreck of the Titanic was pretty much up for grabs to anyone who could get there first. Cue Titanic Ventures, a US-based company who funded French oceanographic company Ifremer to carry out survey and salvage operations on their behalf. Now, Titanic Ventures had absolutely no connection to the wreck itself. In fact, it was co-founded by a man by the name of George Tulloch, who actually made his fortune owning the largest BMW dealership in the United States. After raising a number of artifacts from the wreck in the years following its discovery, Titanic Ventures would eventually be named Salvers in Possession of the Titanic in 1994. Not because they were qualified or complied with any guidelines, but simply because they'd got there first. The company spent years plundering the wreck for artifacts for what they said would be conservation purposes. However, the vast majority were raised for a very different purpose, and that was to be showcased in a now infamous live TV special called Return to the Titanic. Return to the Titanic is one of the most bizarre pieces of television I've ever seen, and I could not recommend it more. This special tries its best to convince you that it is an official event. It's hosted at the Paris Scientific Institution with a panel of experts, and Telly Savalas is wearing a tuxedo, though it's all just there to hide what this really is, which is bad reality TV. Hosting the special live was of course a big decision, but not to worry, it's not like anything went wrong during it.
The Titanic inspired many myths at Ohio State University, the surface. The sinking of
The special spends most of its time not showing the artifacts, but simply hyping up the importance of conserving them for future generations, quickly followed by Telly Savalas manhandling all of them without gloves. And this whole notion of these artifacts being so historically important is thoroughly undercut by just how awkward this thing ends up being.
That's quite a lot. Oh, what are these things? Do you want to be looking at this and see what's in there?
A watch.
Yeah, I guess it needs a lot of cleaning.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Because they slowly realise that these things have no real value to anyone apart from the fact that they were on the Titanic and their owner might have drowned. The special ended up being one of the highest rated of the year, and it garnered a lot of attention, but not a lot of it was positive, and it was rightly criticised by many for being disrespectful to survivors. But despite those criticisms, the special ends with Savalas emphasising to the audience that none of these artifacts would ever be for sale, that they will be restored and housed in a permanent collection. I will let you take a wild guess whether that actually happened. Titanic Ventures, now under a new name of RMS Titanic Inc., had made an agreement with Ifremer that they would not sell any of the artifacts. An agreement that they quickly found a way around by charging other private entities a small fee to become co-conservators, rather than owners, of raised pieces of coal from the Titanic debris field. And they then used the profits from this to fund their biggest act of plunder yet, the raising of the now famous Big Piece. But unlike Ballard's discovery, this was not a moment of scientific achievement, but a PR event orchestrated by Tulloch, defined by money and fame. The company even organised a fleet of cruise ships that flogged tickets at $6,000 a piece, where people could watch the raising with onboard casinos and champagne, and even some surviving Titanic passengers. And the whole attempt was partly paid for by the Discovery Channel, who had decided to essentially sell their scientific credibility in exchange for receiving full filming access of the wreck from Tulloch, so that they could make their own live TV special called Titanic Live. The raising of the Big Piece caused uproar from marine biologists, scientists, and historians, basically anyone who knew what they were talking about. And many Titanic survivors also called out the event for what it really was, an act of grave robbing manipulated into mass entertainment. Ballard compared the efforts of RMS Titanic Inc. to stealing the jewels off the body of an old lady.
I mean, they've basically taken the jewels off of the old lady in her grave.
Which is ironic, because that is something that they literally did. After finding a watch on the seabed, Tulloch made a big effort of reuniting it with that passenger's surviving daughter. That is until they immediately took it back after she died, because technically they had only loaned it to her for life. A reminder that this is a man who has had to spend most of his career fighting off claims that he is a grave robber, to which he would usually respond that his interests were purely in conserving history.
It is conservation triage, because it's emergency work done on critically ill objects.
Well, coincidentally, RMS Titanic Inc.'s parent company, Premier Exhibitions, had their own legal scandal after it was revealed in an ABC News investigation that the cadavers used in their Bodies exhibition were not obtained legally, but, let's say it together, stolen from graves. Responding to the controversy, the Discovery Channel and Tulloch emphasised the delicate nature of their operations that would not disturb the wreck in any way.
Where's the rope? Where's the rope?
Their initial attempt to raise the Big Piece was made with nylon lines that quickly snapped under pressure, causing the piece to tumble back down to the ocean floor. Meaning, not only did they fail not to disturb the wreck, they somehow managed to sink the Titanic again. And the actual way that they got the Big Piece out was by attaching large balloons to that section of the hull and raising it to the surface, essentially treating a priceless piece of history like the house from Up. The big piece had finally been raised, and it could now be conserved as a vital part of maritime history in a permanent collection. And what better place to conserve history than where the big piece finally ended up, in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, for businessmen to take selfies with on a coke binge. In an interview with the US Navy institution, Ballard presented the most cogent counter-argument to this phony act of conservation. That when you remove a piece of history from its original context, you inherently devalue it. A shoe from the Titanic for someone to gawk at in a museum is nowhere near as powerful as seeing it in its original context on the seabed. Basically, the real truth is that no one should be entitled to the Titanic, and yet it was given merely to those who wanted it and had the leverage to take it, sating the bottomless egos of industrial titans.
I'll tell you who's a grave robber. The people who robbed people like Stanley Lord, Captain Stanley Lord on the California. People like Captain E.J. Smith of his reputation. These are people who robbed the graves. These are people who took dead people who had no ability to defend themselves and robbed them of their reputation. Those are grave robbers.
RMS Titanic Inc. and their parent company Premier Exhibitions made millions over the years touring the raised artifacts around the world and now have permanent collections in Orlando and Las Vegas, complete with full-scale replicas of the Grand Staircase. And all of this is done whilst the company only had temporary salvage rights. Eventually, in 2011, a US district judge ruled that the company did indeed have full title to the artifacts, but they stipulated that they could only profit from them by exhibiting them. Whilst they had made their fair share of money, their hugely expensive salvage efforts combined with legal costs meant that this purely money-making endeavour in the end actually made very little money. And only a year later, they were no longer the only players in the Titanic game. UNESCO finally granted the wreck with official status protections to prevent further pillaging, and the opening of the Belfast Titanic Museum threatened to draw away much of their client base. And so in 2018, RMS Titanic Inc. decided to hatch their biggest scheme yet, by declaring bankruptcy. As part of liquidation processes, they now had a convenient legal impetus to auction off the over 5,000 Titanic artifacts in their possession as company assets in order to repay creditors. And despite James Cameron and Ballard forming a consortium to buy these artifacts, they couldn't raise enough money to meet the minimum $60 million bid, and so all of the artifacts were sold off to private hedge funds and haven't been seen since. And if I had to put money on it, I imagine they're somewhere in a glass onion right now. And despite filing for bankruptcy only a few years ago, RMS Titanic have been at it again in the past few years when they launched an expedition to try and retrieve the famous Marconi telegraph machine. Thankfully, by 2020, an international treaty was in place that forced them to back off from these plans, but the sad fact is that much of the damage has already been done to the wreck during their salvage efforts, and they are still operational to this day, recently announcing plans to have Titanic NFTs. I want to die. But even with all that, the story of the Titanic's wreck isn't all cynicism and corporate corruption. The wreck itself is almost like one of the new wonders of the world. It inspires deep and profound emotions in anyone who witnesses it, as well as a plethora of TV documentaries. Some great, some...
They didn't give me no binoculars.
And it was one man who, when he first laid eyes on the wreck, made a scrawl in his notebook that read, "Do story with bookends of present-day scene of wreck, using submersibles intercut with memories of a survivor, and recreated scenes of the night of the sinking. A crucible of human values under stress." That man was James Cameron. That's right, we finally got there, guys. It's now time to talk about Titanic, the 1996 Canadian miniseries. Titanic, the 1996 miniseries, runs at over 2 hours, and just like the real Titanic itself, is split into 2 parts. Now initially you might think this is the most poorly timed filmmaking effort of all time, until you start to realise that they knew exactly what they were doing. Producers of this miniseries insisted that they didn't know about Cameron's movie before they started production, but not only did they both shoot in Canada, Cameron's Titanic was one of the most widely reported film productions of all time. The simple fact is that this miniseries was rushed into production because they knew that even if they were going to pale by comparison, they were guaranteed to capitalise on the massive Titanic hype that was just around the corner. And you know what? It kind of worked, because despite this miniseries being a huge flop when it first aired and being largely forgotten about by most human beings, it did enjoy somewhat of a second life in the years following its release. And by second life, I of course mean being shown on Brazilian TV as Titanic 2 and tricking generations of confused old people into renting the wrong Titanic movie at Blockbuster. And to be fair to them, this movie does look very similar to James Cameron's movie. However, in reality, they could not be more different. Titanic the miniseries is a Titanic adaptation where every expense has been spared, where historical accuracy has been thrown out the window. It's the Titanic, but done cheap and trashy.
Come on. Turn, whore, turn.
Now, I'm not going to go through the countless historical inaccuracies of this miniseries. There are many people on the internet who have done a very thorough job of that, and to be honest, I'm not very concerned with the fact that the ship is moored wrongly, because those inaccuracies are a mere byproduct of the systemic shortcuts that were made to rush this thing out in time. So many parts of this feels like it's falling apart at the seams, and that is because that was literally happening. During the sinking scenes, parts of the set became badly water damaged, which leads us to these strategically placed extras who were not holding up the set, and with a TV budget, they obviously couldn't afford stars like Leonardo DiCaprio or Kate Winslet, so instead we get an array of lesser-known actors, almost all of whom are trying and failing to do another accent.
What's wrong with my bloody suit?
Oh, it looks grim, Phillips. We're sinking by the head.
You're probably the only bloke who took the head seriously. We'll do the best we can, eh?
I was initially looking forward to Tim Curry in this to bring some much needed gravitas, but not only does he feature in a painfully unnecessary scene of sexual violence, he also turns in a thoroughly TV movie level performance with an Irish accent that just goes full ghetto at one point.
Give it up, boy!
So all in all, this miniseries is pretty much irredeemable in every aspect, but I highly recommend you watch it if you want to take part in a new drinking game that I've invented, which is drink every time there is a moment of ironic foreshadowing about the fact that the ship is going to sink later.
We're not going to need lifeboats.
I'm afraid that I enjoy uneventful sea voyages.
Shall sink in the dark waters and never be heard of again.
Makes me wonder if I should just stop here.
I'm through with the bloomin' sea. After this one, I'll go back home, make an honest woman of me, Linda.
Which finally brings us on to the one that we've all been waiting for. You guessed it, 1997's The Chambermaid on the Titanic. Okay, I am joking, even I didn't watch that one. It's James Cameron's Titanic. Now, you know this movie. Even if you haven't seen it, you have. It is one of the few things that I would genuinely call a cultural reset. And that is because it didn't just revive the Titanic story in the public consciousness, it became it. Most people, when they think about Titanic, will be drawing from this movie in their head. And that was more or less exactly what James Cameron intended to do with this movie. He wanted to fulfill a desire that people had had since 1912, to make a definitive visualization of this moment in history. And it's crazy to think that even after all this time, after 8 movies about the same ship sinking, a movie about the Titanic would go on to become the highest grossing movie of all time. Which brings us back to that question of why. Why was it the story of the Titanic that would go on to be so universal and ubiquitous around the world? Now, you could watch Lindsay Ellis's video to find out, but I'll give it a crack, eh? Because what is this video if not the 1996 miniseries to her 1997 film? Longer, trashier, worse. To understand why this movie did what it did, you have to understand a core truth, and that is that James Cameron always wins. You can disagree with James Cameron. You can earnestly dislike his movies, but you can never feasibly argue that what he put on screen was not absolutely his intention. Now, that does make him a borderline psychopath to work for, but it does mean he makes some pretty good movies. The story of how this movie came about originates with James Cameron tricking movie executives into paying for him to go to the bottom of the ocean and see the Titanic. Cameron had given the impression to executives that he was looking to make a film about the Titanic, something he had almost zero intention of doing at the time. He just wanted to go in one of those submarines again because, you know what he's like. And I think that was because, like us, he knew deep down there wasn't really much more meaningful to be said about this event. But as Cameron finally laid eyes upon the wreck, he didn't just get an idea for a movie, he had a full emotional epiphany. He became overwhelmed with the power of its story. Suddenly, James Cameron went from being largely ambivalent to having a profound sense of purpose. He was going to make people care about the Titanic again. And so he started by building the Titanic again and sinking it. However, spectacle was just one part of the equation. He didn't just want to wow audiences, he wanted them to feel the same emotions he had. And so he started by writing one of the most iconic romances in film history. And that's the thing about James Cameron's Titanic, because it is arguably the ultimate Titanic movie, but it's also not really about the Titanic at all. Just like the 1953 movie, James Cameron's Titanic is really just a classic Hollywood love story with some very good production value as its backdrop. Hence the criticisms that were hurled at this movie upon release, like it's just Romeo and Juliet on a ship, it's so overly romanticized. Professional film critics called this romance film overly romanticized. Well, guess what? That's the whole point, dummies. Cameron embraced a harsh truth about the Titanic story, that trying to make a mass audience truly empathize with 1,500 people that died nearly a century ago is almost impossible. But by creating a single love story that was universal, that could resonate with anyone around the world, you essentially create a Trojan horse into making people feel the human cost of the Titanic, one that is on a personal scale but feels massive in its magnitude. At the end of the day, Titanic is a simple movie. Love conquers all. It's a very simple message about the human spirit and about love and loss. But in order to communicate a simple message effectively, it requires a level of genius in its delivery. James Cameron's Titanic is a prime case study in the fact that simple emotional messages are not inherently invaluable. Neither is romanticization mutually exclusive with emotional authenticity. Now, I will admit that there are some moments in this movie that are, let's say, broad. And some moments do exaggerate history to the point that they did sort of defame a real guy. So they sent a Fox executive to that man's hometown to donate a check for $5,000. Class act, guys. James Cameron's movie And a Night to Remember forms sort of a perfect yin and yang about the disparate emotions that we can feel about this event. You can feel despair and sadness, or a raw sense of being alive and a human kinship. Titanic finds the beauty in its tragedy, the same way that there is beauty to be found in all loss. One is about the meaninglessness, and one is about the meaning. However, one of the main lessons from the Titanic story is that you can't control your legacy, and whilst I think this movie itself is a nuanced, respectful interpretation of the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what everyone else took from it. This movie created Titanic mania, and whilst it's not the movie's fault, much of the weird shit that has happened since can be directly linked back to this film. Such as this couple, who in 2001 got married on the bow of the Titanic, you know, where people died. This movie, of course, spawned another endless wave of Titanic documentaries, but I think the best documentary you can watch is this YouTube video I found of a movie theatre in America on Titanic's opening night. I think it's an incredible dissection of where we were culturally at this moment in time.
Hurry up, go get our popcorn.
You are so retarded.
However, for all the madness that this movie caused, the true worst was yet to come, in a realm that the Titanic had not yet explored, and that was the world of anime. You may already know a bit about the animated Titanic movies. Certain YouTubers have talked extensively about how weird and wacky they are, and it's true, these movies have all the moments that you've seen screen grabs of on the internet. The rapping dog, the rapping shark, a mouse called Camembert using his whiskers as telegraph lines and being electrocuted to death. But believe me when I say that those moments are the least interesting thing about these movies. The animated Titanic movies form a sort of unofficial trilogy, starting with 1999's The Legend of the Titanic. And as you can guess just from looking at the poster, this movie was more or less a complete rip-off of James Cameron's Titanic. However, the animated version was sort of clever in that it repackaged that movie for the one audience on the planet that it couldn't reach, which was kids. So in this version of Titanic, the story is not recounted by an old lady, but by a grandfather mouse to his grandchildren, and the ship is not sunk by an iceberg, but by evil sharks and a benevolent sea monster called Tentacles, who ends up saving everyone on board. All of this led to the movie being rightly criticised for being deeply disrespectful of a real human tragedy, especially when you realise that survivors were still alive at this point. Now, whilst I sincerely hope that a survivor did not see a frame of this, the film does have somewhat of a defence in the way that its ending implies that the grandfather mouse was just making all of this up to spare his grandchildren from the true horror of this event. And it's moments like that that really prompted my interest here, because for a lot of this movie, there is this sort of scattershot weirdness that is emblematic of a sort of cheap knockoff made purely for money where no one cared what the final product was. So for example, this movie has kind of a tacked on eco message about how we should be nice to the sea and the creatures that inhabit it because they're sentient and have feelings. The bad guy's evil plan is that he wants access to the world's oceans so that he can expand his whaling empire. And then there is also the weird distinction where all sharks are portrayed as evil, but dolphins are magical and angelic. Basically, all of that made me very curious to find out who made this and why. Well, finding the actual creators of Legend of the Titanic was not as simple as I thought it was going to be, because this movie is the result of a multinational consortium of production companies that includes Spanish and American producers, an Italian director and writer, and animation courtesy of a studio based in North Korea. Now that sounds like a pretty complicated production process, but don't worry, because it's not like any vital details were lost in translation.
I'd like to draw to your attention the fact that she's a woman and you're a mouse. Well, there's one thing I'm not, and that's a racist.
Eventually, I discovered that the main mastermind behind this thing was Mondo TV, an Italian company that made its start in the 1970s by licensing Japanese animation for the European market. But eventually, that business model developed into a full-fledged scam when they contracted North Korean animation company SEK, whose borderline slave labor allowed them to churn out fast, cheap knockoff versions of the biggest Western animations that they could then sell to European markets for a fraction of the price. And this movie is a result of that process. It's why it's essentially a hybrid between Titanic and An American Tail. However, I think what Mondo TV didn't anticipate with this scheme was that SEK would end up having a lot more influence than they first anticipated, which I will go on to explain in full detail with this film. But first, SEK was initially started in 1957 as a way to use animation to educate children in North Korea. It's not a production company as much as it was an arm of the state. In Kim Jong-il's treatise on cinema, he emphasized the importance of film as a tool for imbuing society with the great Juche idea. Juche is the central term for the state ideology of North Korea, and its origins are inextricably linked to the country's resistance against Japanese colonialism during the early 20th century. The term itself is derived from a Japanese word, which was used by nationalist Korean leaders during the occupation to lament their lack of sovereignty and self-reliance. And when North Korea was eventually founded in the wake of the Korean War, Juche became the idea upon which it was built, one that mandated the total independence of the state that would exclude the influence of the outside world and remain loyal to a single leader. Now, I can't break down the minutiae and complexities of the strained relationship between Japan and North Korea over the last century, but I have seen every Titanic movie. And I know that 1999's The Legend of the Titanic contains a villain who is a member of the whaling industry, one where Japan controls a third of the world's stake in, and that dolphins come to save the day, an animal that the state of North Korea has since tried to militarize and given a place of pride in state dolphinariums constructed in Pyongyang. Now, you could absolutely argue, I am reaching a bit here. Well, to that I would say, we haven't even got to the sequel yet. In 2004, Mondo and SEK reunited to make a sequel called In Search of the Titanic, which really has nothing to do with the Titanic at all. The movie initially follows our returning main characters, now voiced by entirely different people, on a voyage to find the wreckage of the Titanic. But their journey is upended entirely when they are kidnapped by the king of Atlantis. He then informs our characters that they can never return to the surface because Atlantis has to remain a secret in order to preserve its utopian society. A terrifying proposition that our characters graciously accept without question. So to reiterate, our characters here are taught the virtues of an entirely secluded monolithic nation state and how blind loyalty to a single leader is fine and that you shouldn't tell any outsiders about it. Now, the whole reason that North Korean animators began doing subcontract work for Western companies in the first place was always a matter of exchange. In exchange for their cheap labor and fast rate of work, SEK animators would be able to learn best practices of Western styles and technologies. But eventually, I think they started to see a bigger opportunity with Mondo TV's movies, and that was to spread the Juche idea to a wider audience than ever before, through the Titanic. And just when you think this couldn't get any more complicated, allow me to introduce you to the third animated Titanic movie, Titanic, The Legend Goes On, which despite having a very similar title to the first Mondo movie and also being made by an Italian production company, has no connection to it whatsoever. And being a cheap knockoff of a cheap knockoff, the budget is so paper thin here that not only is the animation bad, there are full-on repeated shots played one after another. Now, this is because Titanic The Legend Goes On did not have SEK to rely on, instead being made almost entirely by a production company based in Italy by the name of Titanic Cartoons SRL Roma. But as we've learned, boys and girls, if a company has Titanic in the name, it's time to get suspicious. And after doing some journalistic digging of clicking no more than 4 Wikipedia hyperlinks, my already burgeoning suspicions of this company were very much confirmed. Titanic Cartoons was really just a company to go down on paper. Its real backer was its distributor, Medusa, which was a subsidiary of the Italian media conglomerate Mediaset, founded by none other than poster boy for political corruption, Silvio Berlusconi. And wouldn't you guess, in 2005 a trial was launched against Mediaset for tax fraud and embezzlement during the period of 1988 to 1998, the year that this film started production. So if you're looking to make a Titanic movie but you feel icky about benefiting off North Korean slave labour, you can still do it as long as it's dirty money from the highest echelons of Italian government. Once again, I'm not a journalist, so take all of this with a grain of salt / don't sue me. After the cultural insanity around this story reached its peak in the early 2000s, the Titanic could really only go down from here. And it did. The Titanic had been a defining moment of the 20th century, and its cultural resurgence at the tail end of it seemed to reaffirm its enduring importance in our history. But only a matter of years later, the importance of the Titanic story was once again fundamentally reappraised by society.
And that's part, I guess, of the odd attraction to it, the fact that you just could never have such a thing happen before or since.
Safe and sound. And the time is 6:16, September 11th, 2001.
Hit by 2 separate hijacked commercial jets.
And then this horrible event happened and slammed us into this perspective.
And it was arguably a big reason why Cameron's movie was so heavily criticised in retrospect, because people were now all too aware of what real human disaster felt like. Just as it happened with both world wars, the Titanic had faded in cultural relevance, and it wasn't clear when, if ever, it would have such a moment again. But what was clear is that if the Titanic story was going to be told again, it would have to be unlike any of the previous adaptations. It would have to be told with a renewed sense of realism and cynicism. You know, Titanic, but dark and gritty. And that time finally came in 2012, when the 100th anniversary spawned a new wave of Titanic documentaries and retrospectives that desperately tried to offer new perspectives to this disaster. Culminating in the form of what would be the last major adaptation, the BBC miniseries simply called Titanic. Now, whilst the idea of a miniseries might give us all flashbacks,
Blimey, you've killed him!
This is British television in 2012, at the height of the golden age TV craze, when we had shows like Sherlock and Sherlock. And that is exactly what this adaptation was going to be. The prestige TV version of the Titanic story. And it looked like it was going to be woke Titanic. It wasn't just going to repeat the same famous stories of rich people that we'd heard over and over again, but focus on the untold stories, the immigrants, the workers that are so often airbrushed out of this event's history. And despite the way our culture has bigged up the Titanic as this century-defining moment, the miniseries does actually acknowledge that this event happened within a broader social and political context. On paper, it sounds like exactly the kind of Titanic story that we needed, but unfortunately it wasn't, because it had one fatal flaw in the form of its creator, Julian Fellowes. Now, if you don't know who Fellowes is, he is the man behind the wildly successful show Downton Abbey. And as such, this miniseries ends up essentially being Downton Abbey on the Titanic. The drama is compelling enough, the acting is competent, the production values are decent, but once you look deeper, you can start to unpack what is not only a deeply romanticised portrayal of this period in history, but borderline conservative propaganda. This series, like Downton Abbey, has the apparent mission statement of giving their rich and poor characters equal screen time, implying that their stories are equally important and respecting their complex innate humanity regardless of their class status. Except none of the characters feel like real human beings, rather broad archetypes that Fellowes can project his fantasies onto. The spunky maid who's smarter than you give her credit for. The rich man who's actually conflicted about being rich. It all serves to perpetuate what is a deeply romantic view of the period that essentially amounts to... When we think of romanticising the past, we often think of something like James Cameron's Titanic, something that makes being on the Titanic look sort of fun. You don't think of a show like this, which is so grounded in British seriousness, it couldn't possibly be romantic. However, the thing about period dramas is that I think they are often a great way for conservatives to try and look liberal by comparison. Because everyone agrees that social conditions 100 years ago weren't very nice. Basically, it's very easy to look like you're being critical of structures like racism and class, while still subliminally protecting them, especially when you are telling a story that focuses on the good that was allowed to flourish despite those things. You know, racism in the South was bad, but the black driver and the white lady actually got on quite well. And it is all emblematic of a nice conservatism, where people can thrive despite oppression, and that good people can fix fundamentally broken systems. Because one of the primary functions of a romanticized past is to placate our present and give us a comfortable feeling of distance. And whilst a show like Titanic seems to be critical of all the right things, the snobbery of the upper class, the overt racism towards immigrants, it's all portrayed in a way that is so broad, it's implicitly saying to its audience, thank God things aren't like this anymore.
Half of them look suspiciously like Catholics.
And even with all those moments, they are all thoroughly undercut by what this miniseries has to actually say about the Titanic disaster.
Although the newspapers will say it's about class, it's not. It's about a society facing a disaster so enormous that all those distinctions become rather meaningless.
There is literally one thing that the Titanic is about, and he somehow missed it. Like, I think Julian Fellowes is the kind of person who would watch The Wire and instead of acknowledging the huge power disparity between how one side is created and perpetuated by the other, just goes, wow, they're both as bad as each other. Where Cameron's movie embraces its fiction to tell an emotional truth, Fellowes' Titanic purports realism while subliminally selling a lie. And this is the ultimate danger of romanticization. Not just that it misrepresents a period in time, but that it tries to make us fall in love with it. We get to the point where we sort of like the way that the Titanic revealed the human spirit.
What you're really impressed by when you study the Titanic is how well they behaved. I mean, the vast majority of them. All types, all, you know.
And it is clear why Fellowes loves the sound of that idea, because at the end of the day, I think he just wants to enjoy the balls and the gowns guilt-free. He would rather not face the uncomfortable truth that there is no such thing as a progressive stately home or an egalitarian Titanic disaster.
And what's wonderful about it is that it's made us all equal. Like I used to say at the end of Human Nature every night, we're all in the same boat.
This is a Titanic story told by someone who isn't just conservative, but fundamentally believes in the hierarchies and structures of the class system. Fellowes was born into the gentry and is a Tory peer in the House of Lords, one of the most corrupt and undemocratic parts of modern British government. So it's absolutely no wonder that all of his shows are dedicated to trying to convince you that not all rich people are corrupt, money-grubbing bastards. Now, there's one upside to all of this. This show was a huge flop and has been largely forgotten about by most audiences. But since then, there hasn't really been another major Titanic adaptation. That is, if you don't count Titanic 2 or Titanic 666. Someone else can watch them, I'm tired.
Oh my god, look at this ship!
But are we failing to learn from history if we assume that the Titanic story won't come back as it has countless times before? I mean, are we going to be stuck in this loop forever? Asking what we can learn from the Titanic seems like kind of a dumb and pointless question, because the Titanic has proved itself to be an entirely unique thing. A tragedy which just so happened to occur at a huge turning point in human history and technological advancement that is then incrementally mythologized over a century. There hasn't really been something like it since, and there likely will never be again. But you could also argue the opposite, that we have failed to learn even the most basic lessons from the Titanic. In fact, what we learn from the Titanic has actually defined its entire history. Capitalism is inherently evil. Capitalism is good. Life is uncertain chaos. Love conquers all. The sea is bad. The sea is good. The story of the Titanic has transcended itself and become a completely different story about what happens when a disaster becomes famous and how it can be appropriated for our own ideologies and profit gain. We will always tell stories about real-life tragedies, not just out of morbid curiosity, but our innate human need to try and control and understand them. And it is not inherently in bad taste to do so. There are numerous ones that are both authentic and effective. But we have to be wary of the fact that sometimes our desire to project our own deeper meanings onto these events can override our responsibility to be truthful in how we portray them. That's not to say that manipulating or romanticizing the past is inherently wrong. You just have to ask who is benefiting from it. What is its purpose? Does manipulating the past serve to try and make the present feel more desirable and stable? Or does our romanticization seek to serve a larger, more immediate purpose? And we also have to ask who has the right to tell these stories, especially when we don't take the agency of its victims into account, when we can very easily re-traumatize them with these portrayals. So what is the future for the Titanic? Has it taken the deaths of 5 people for us to finally realize the true extent of our Titanic problem? Or is this just the beginning of yet another chapter? Perhaps it may be like the real ship itself, that it is destined to eventually fade, dissolving until one day it entirely ceases to exist. But for now, the Titanic story continues to hold powerful sway in our society. I mean, there's no better example than the fact that over 100 years ago, the Titanic sinking was a symbol of social and political unrest in the shipping quarter of Belfast, and now that area is named after the ship, with Titanic tourism being one of the city's main sources of economic income. Now, I want to reiterate there is nothing wrong with having an interest or even loving the Titanic. I'm admittedly one of them now. But I think if we've learned anything, it's that we need to put some distance between ourselves and this event. We've all been taught the dangers of trying to get too close to it. And the only people that have the power to do that is us, and we do it by not buying any more dumb Titanic shit. The day that the Titanic stops becoming a financially valuable asset is the day that its story will truly die. In the end, we have to let go. We have to let go of the Titanic. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I will now leave you with the first and only Our Ewan Titanic Awards. Take it away.
What have I done? It is a cruel joke. To have left our lives in Dorchester for this.
You see, with the little air that's left, there will not be enough for them to survive back to the surface.
If that's true, then it means there's nothing left for us to do.
We found it.
Would have been really scary just to see it be out in the cold and knowing the ship's going down. So.
If you were given a chance to go back to the Titanic, would you?
No,